Welcome back to the course, Understanding Our Political Economy. This is Lecture 5, The Natural Laws Concerning the Production and Distribution of Wealth. Henry George brought his analytical skills to the challenge of explaining the processes by which wealth is produced and then distributed back to the factors of production: rent to land, wages to labor, and interest to capital goods. These processes were, he concluded, governed by natural laws of tendency that flow from consistent human behavior. It was David Ricardo who made the first attempt to apply scientific observation to how land is chosen for development. Ricardo's focus was on agriculture and the differences in natural fertility. Ricardo wrote, "After all the fertile land in the immediate neighborhood of the first settlers were cultivated, if capital and population increased, more food would be required, and it could only be procured from land not so advantageously situated. Thus, by bringing successively land of a worse quality or less favorably situated into cultivation, rent would rise on the land previously cultivated." Henry George extended Ricardo's analysis well beyond a treatment of agricultural land and applied it to locations in cities and towns and to all that George came to describe as natural monopolies. The definition of rent Henry George came to is as follows. Rent is that portion of production or wealth claimed in return for access to land, when land of equal quality is no longer freely available. Rent is determined by the margin of production. That is, rent equals the amount of produce in excess of what could be produced from the poorest land in use with the same amount of labor and capital. Note that Henry George's definition is descriptive here. He will later in his analysis add moral judgments with regard to the distribution of rent to private individuals and entities rather than the community as a whole. Returning to the theoretically ideal community we earlier established, we might ask whether we can take a scientific look at what happens to the initial equality of opportunity achieved by our old world forefathers. Subsistence remains 60 units of wealth. A generation after the city is established, the same size land parcel, now used for commerce rather than agriculture, yields 300 units of wealth, now acquired by exchange of goods and services. There is no longer any land in the city that can be settled on for free. Let's look at this process using some simple graphs. Returning again to the earliest stage of settlement, when all land initially is freely accessible, the best locations will potentially yield 100 units of wealth. The entire yield is wages, the return to labor, and interest, the return to capital goods, in some proportion, determined by the productivity of labor and the quality of the capital goods available. When land yielding 100 units of wealth is fully occupied, the next best locations, still freely accessible, yield 90 units of wealth. Now, the best locations can command rent of 10 units. Political economy describes the best freely accessible land as the margin of production. Looking into the future, when all land able to provide subsistence or greater production is fully occupied, the best locations now have an advantage equal to 40 units of output. These 40 units are what constitutes the rent attached to these locations. Producers cannot afford to turn over more than 40 units of wealth as rent because 60 units is the minimum required for subsistence. Only when labor productivity increases by the introduction of new forms of capital goods and new technologies will rents continue their upward climb. There is another way to show these relationships that might make the impact clearer. Presented in a somewhat different way by using a circle graph, we see that before we learned to make and use tools, all wealth was produced by labor, and all wealth was returned to labor as wages. As people learned new technologies and developed more efficient tools, total wealth produced grew dramatically. So long as there were no permanent settlements, wealth was distributed to labor as wages and to capital goods as interest. At a time when people were largely self-sufficient, working on the land in agriculture and other crafts, this basic relationship was clear. The modern economy, in which most people are employed by business entities and paid a monetary wage, obscures the fact that labor may be producing greater wealth, that is wages, than the worker is receiving in monetary compensation. Settlement meant that eventually the best locations were taken, sometimes used, sometimes held idle. These locations command an increasing amount of rent as a claim on the total wealth produced. Over time, as population generates an increasing demand for land, wages tend to be driven down as even quite marginally productive land commands rent. Externalities abound to affect the quantity and quality of wealth produced by labor and capital goods. Natural disasters, for example, destroy enormous amounts of what we produce. Yet the basic distribution of wealth is governed by the fundamental relations described earlier. As Henry George explains, where land is free and labor is assisted by capital, wages will consist of the whole produce less what is necessary to induce the storing up of labor as capital. Where land is subject to ownership and rent arises, wages will be fixed by what labor could secure from the highest natural opportunities open to it without paying rent. That is, the margin of production. Where all natural opportunities are monopolized, wages may be forced by competition among laborers to the minimum at which they will consent to reproduce. These natural laws described by Henry George are, however, laws of tendency, influenced by a long list of what economists call externalities. The form of government, the system of law, and how government raises its revenue are at the top of this list. And that is the end of Lecture 5.